Let's just jump right into this explainer, because today we're going to completely reframe everything you thought you knew about William Howard Taft. You know, the guy history basically just remembers as the fat president. Oh, it is so much more than that.
Seriously, what do you actually know about our 27th president? For most of us, our entire knowledge of the guy is probably limited to that one famous, kind of slapstick story about him getting stuck in a White House bathtub. It's a trivia question, right? A punchline. But honestly, reducing this man's life to a visual gag is an absolute injustice. We're ignoring literally one of the most fascinating psychological dramas in American history.
Because that bathtub, it is not a punchline. It is a tragedy of Gothic horror. Think about it. The moment it took 6 grown men to physically pry a panic-stricken president out of cold porcelain, that wasn't a comedy. That was the physical breaking point of a man who was absolutely suffocating under immense pressure. Taft never wanted the crown, you guys, but he was forced onto the throne anyway. So as we go through this, we're going to see what looks like an inverted hero's journey, a man who was ground into dust by the machinery of power.
Let's start with part 1, the wreckage of power.
To really understand where this wreckage started, we have to look at his father, Alonzo Taft. In the Taft household, love wasn't unconditional. It was a currency, and you earned it through rigid excellence. This dynamic created Will's fatal flaw, extreme agreeableness. Now, for most of us, being agreeable is a good thing. It makes you a great friend, a nice neighbor, but in the ultra-high-stakes political world that Alonzo groomed his son for, it was a fatal vulnerability. Young Will Taft simply could not say no to his parents. He absorbed all of their crushing expectations and completely buried his own desires for just, peace and quiet. Why? Because he was absolutely terrified of disappointing the people he loved. He spent his life sprinting on a treadmill just to keep the wolves of criticism at bay.
Which brings us to part 2, the reluctant rise.
See, Taft's modest dreams were constantly colliding with the massive ambitions of the people closest to him, specifically his incredibly brilliant wife Nellie and his best friend, a guy you might have heard of, Theodore Roosevelt. Taft deeply, deeply yearned for the sanctuary of the law. To him, a judge's bench was this binary, stable world. It had rules, it had precedents, a clear right and wrong. He just wanted to understand the world, not conquer it. But Nellie, she didn't want to interpret the law, she wanted to make history. She kind of saw her husband as a vessel for her own presidential ambitions. And Teddy Roosevelt saw Taft's brilliant legal mind as the perfect tool to ground his own impulsive political agenda. So Taft was constantly, relentlessly pushed away from his safe sanctuary of the law and shoved into the messy, sharp-elbowed chaos of politics.
And this actually brings us to a heartbreakingly prophetic quote from his dying mother, Louise Taft. Listen to this. She warned, "I do not want my son to be president. His is a judicial mind and he loves the law." I mean, wow. Even his own mother recognized that his gentle, eager-to-please nature was completely mismatched for the brutal reality of executive power. But the machine was already in motion, and Taft, true to form, just couldn't bring himself to stop it.
If we track his career, it is literally a forced march of a man constantly abandoning his own happiness. Okay, so he was a very happy federal judge back in the 1890s, right? But he was pushed to become Solicitor General. Then he hated the heat and the whole idea of imperialism, but he was pushed to become governor of the Philippines. And here's the craziest part. Twice, literally twice, he was offered a seat on the Supreme Court, his ultimate dream job, and both times he turned it down because Nellie and Roosevelt told him his duty was elsewhere. It is so sad. So how did he cope with duties he absolutely despised? He started stress eating on an industrial scale. He was basically building a physical prison for himself, calorie by calorie.
Which leads us to part 3, the nightmare presidency.
For Taft, the presidency was an inescapable cage. And the misery? It immediately compounded when his intensely ambitious wife Nellie suffered a severe stroke. She lost her speech, her mobility, basically leaving Taft completely alone to run the country while also acting as her nursemaid. He was drowning in the guilt of carrying her shattered ambitions on his own back. Yet, here's a really profound paradox about the guy. Despite being absolutely miserable, he was incredibly competent. He actually busted more trust than Theodore Roosevelt did. He fought for the federal income tax. He established the postal savings system. The man was pulling grueling 16-hour days and achieving massive administrative success. But because he lacked Roosevelt's manic, super poetic energy, the public just saw his cautious respect for the Constitution as, well, boring and kind of cowardly.
But, the body keeps the score. 350 pounds. His weight ballooned, acting almost like a physical armor against all that relentless stress. We have to understand, This wasn't just a lack of discipline, it was a desperate act of self-medication. And all this weight led to catastrophic obstructive sleep apnea. At night, his throat would collapse, literally strangling him in his sleep and jerking him awake hundreds of times. So during the day, his oxygen-starved brain would just shut down. He'd fall asleep right in the middle of cabinet meetings. The press cruelly mocked this as sheer laziness, but they were completely unaware that the man was essentially dying of oxygen deprivation.
And then came the cruelest blow of the whole ordeal. Theodore Roosevelt returned from his trip to Africa fully expecting Taft to just be his obedient proxy. But when Taft actually stood his ground, respecting the law over Roosevelt's massive ego, Roosevelt publicly betrayed him. He literally called his former best friend a puzzlewit and a fathead. Taft was absolutely devastated. There's this story of a reporter finding him in the Oval Office weeping uncontrollably, crying out that Roosevelt had been his closest friend. That betrayal, it broke something deep inside him.
Okay, moving to part 4, Liberation in Defeat. The 1912 election was an absolute political slaughter, largely driven by Roosevelt's vindictive third-party run, and it resulted in a very specific number, 8. That was Taft's total electoral votes in 1912. To this day, it remains the absolute worst repudiation of an incumbent president in American history. He only won 2 states. It was just a total massacre at the ballot box.
But wait, how do you think Taft reacted to this? While a staff was bracing for gloom and tears, Taft was actually walking around cracking jokes. He gleefully told a friend that he had just been elected ex-president of the United States. He was laughing because the cage door was finally open. He happily retreated to teach law at Yale, and almost immediately he shed 70 pounds. His sleep apnea totally vanished. The mental fog lifted. Without the crushing cortisol of the presidency constantly in his system, his body finally started to heal.
Finally, part 5, the Supreme Redemption.
Jump ahead to 1921, and President Warren G. Harding finally offers Taft the one and literally only job he had ever truly coveted, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And upon taking the bench, Taft wrote something amazing. He said, "I don't remember that I ever was president. It's like a psychological amputation." He viewed his 4 years in the White House not as the pinnacle of his career, but as this traumatic interruption, a fever dream that he actively wanted to just completely expunge from his memory. He had finally found his destiny.
And man, in this role, this supposedly lazy guy aggressively modernized the court. He pushed through the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave the Supreme Court the power to actually choose its own cases. Think about that. He fundamentally saved the American legal system from drowning in trivia, just by giving it the power of refusal. He also secured the funding and helped design the majestic white marble Supreme Court building that we all know today. It is such a profound irony, isn't it? The man who could never say no in his personal life basically saved our entire justice system by giving it the power to say no.
But sadly, all those decades of stress and untreated apnea had already done irreversible damage to his heart. He passed away in 1930, honestly, from sheer exhaustion. And he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, which is a deeply fitting choice. I mean, Arlington is for soldiers, right? For casualties of duty. And Taft was absolutely a casualty of lifelong, unrelenting duty. He's kind of the patron saint of the good son, a man who spent 72 years swallowing his own dreams just to make everyone else happy. So I want to leave you with this one really powerful thought. The story of William Howard Taft is not a joke. It is a mirror reflecting the terrifying cost of pure compliance. When the world demands you be a king, do you have the courage to remain just a judge? Think about where in your own life you are saying yes when you desperately need to say no. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.